There we go. Okay, I have some announcements to make. Did you have a question for me, Pamela, before we get started?
No, nope, I'm
Okay.
ready.
All right. My name's Dave Munger, and I'm a librarian with Sacramento Public Library. Welcome to this month's genealogy workshop, Carved in Stone, Cemetery Research. Okay, now I'm going to repeat a few quick notes before we get started. All microphones have been muted to limit distraction. I'll change the setting to let you unmute yourself after the talk concludes so you can ask questions of our speaker, Pamela Dallas. Today's session will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. I'll put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. Because we are posting this video, for privacy reasons, we will not enable you to turn on your own video. If you have technical issues during the presentation, please send me a message directly in the chat and I'll do my best to help. I will also note all questions to be asked during the Q&A after the presentation. If you have questions about future genealogy presentations or to receive a copy of the handout, please email contact@saclibrary.org. I'll also post a copy of the handout to the chat for download. Now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Pamela Bell Dallas. She has enjoyed conducting personal and client research for more than 30 years using a wide variety of repositories and record sources. She has presented genealogy lectures at national and regional conferences and given full-day seminars. She often gives presentations to local libraries, like ours, and at local genealogy meetings. Pamela's genealogical focus is Midwest research, methodology, and unique record sources. Pamela is a graduate of Indiana University and is a member of the National Genealogical Society, the Genealogical Speakers Guild, and the Association of Professional Genealogists. Her presentation today is Carved in Stone, Cemetery Research. Pamela, I'll pass the virtual mic to you now.
Thank you, Dave. And again, thank you to the Sacramento Public Library for supporting genealogists and researchers in the Sacramento area and beyond. We appreciate your partnership and dedication. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for a discussion on cemetery research. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to get started. Obviously, visiting the cemetery in person is the most fun and the best way to conduct cemetery research, but we're also going to discuss ways to research online via phone calls and a lot of different ways to do our cemetery research. This is, of course, an early tombstone, obviously from New England. For those who research in New England, you'll recognize the style. And that's another one of the things we're going to talk about today is the different styles of cemeteries and the tombstones themselves. All of us who do genealogy know that it can be a bit confusing and we can irritate those sometimes who don't understand our addiction. And so I also want to just, I'm sure we all do it. I'm sure all of you do it. And I try to remember to do it, to thank those who help us along the way. And if you find a helpful person at a cemetery office or the office of a funeral home, monument company, please let them know how much you appreciate their assistance. We're going to start off with talking about the different types of cemeteries, and people categorize cemeteries in different ways. Everyone has their own method, their own way of doing it. I like to think about the way that the records are available, how easily accessible the records are, and the different types of records. So typically with a religious cemetery, obviously that is a cemetery that is made available for the members or the parishioners of that religious group, that religious order. Prior to World War II, a lot of the cemeteries were part of the church grounds or next to the building. And as we in time approached the early to mid 1940s, the price of land and the availability of land in major cities, urban areas became more expensive and a little more scarce, and a lot of religious organizations moved the actual graves and certainly moved the stones in order to expand their buildings. Some of those records are very easy to find. If it's a Catholic cemetery, the diocese most likely has those records or knows where the records are. There is a Methodist church in downtown Indianapolis that we think moved the actual remains, certainly moved the tombstones about 20 miles outside of town, which at the time was quite a ways. And I'm sure they intended to keep those records, but today nobody seems to know where those records are. So cemetery records with religious cemeteries tend to follow the same rules or accessibility guidelines of other records. With some religious groups, they're very easy to find, and there's an overseeing body that maintains those, and others not. With public or municipal cemeteries, those cemeteries are typically owned by a town, a city, a township, a county, a state. And typically those records, not everything survives, but typically those records are available on that jurisdictional level. And then, of course, we have the veteran national cemeteries, our military cemeteries, and pretty much every state has several military cemeteries, and those records are very easy to access. Obviously, those are accessible through the Veterans Administration, and there is a website on your handout, the nationwide gravesite locator, where you can look up an individual service member or a particular cemetery. And then there's the private, the commercial cemeteries. Those are businesses, and the records of who they sold the plot, the actual land to. It is a real estate purchase, and who they allowed to be buried there is part of their business records. And so those records are typically fairly easy to find and available. Okay. And then there's the family and the home burial plot. Ironically, there are states that still allow people to do home burial. California is not one of them, but there are states that allow that. But typically when we think of the family plot, the family burial plot, we think of the earlier times in this country in the rural areas where individuals buried their family, their loved ones, their close friends on the family farm, so to speak. You will see a little later in the presentation, one of my ancestors buried in the middle of the cornfield in rural Indiana. You did not have to be a wealthy family to have your own family plot, just, maybe at the local cemetery, but often right on your private land. For those doing Southern research, it was not at all unusual for the more prominent, but maybe not as wealthy, or maybe wealthy but not as prominent individuals to request to be buried on the land at the plantation of the most prominent individuals. And of course, most of those plantations did not survive the Civil War, and neither did a lot of those family plots. And then there's the lodge cemeteries. Most of those are no longer operating. Probably the best known is the Oddfellows, and those, for the most part, have been acquired by businesses, other organizations, and many are no longer operating, but those records typically have been maintained either by the organization that acquired the cemetery, or they're still in the Oddfellows records. And then there are prison cemeteries. There are a handful of prisons in a handful of states that have their own cemetery right on the prison grounds. And so if you're trying to find someone who was in prison, they may be buried at the prison site. whether they're family or friends, or there was no one to take care of the final disposition of the body, they could be buried there. And then, of course, as time goes on, today the eco-friendly green cemeteries are becoming more and more popular, and those are businesses, so those records would be business records for that cemetery, that company. And then, of course, I can't forget the pet cemeteries. The pet cemeteries date back to the late 1800s. A veterinarian in New York allowed a client to bury their pet in his apple orchard, and it took off from there. Typically, humans are not allowed to be buried in pet cemeteries, although some states do allow cremains to be buried along with their pet. So if you know of a family that had a pet, if you've read it in a correspondence, a diary, newspaper, that somebody buried their pet in the pet cemetery, get a hold of those records, because they could list, they could have had a funeral or some attendance at the site, and they might list those who attended, and certainly they will list who paid for it. And so that's information that you're going to want to get. Cemetery classifications, different than the types of cemeteries, but just information that goes along with that. We discussed our oldest church graveyards, the family cemetery, the country cemetery, usually small rural cemeteries with natural landscaping. It tends to be a little bit hilly often. The tombstones are there sort of randomly placed. Sometimes you can tell there's sort of a family area or section, sometimes not. There's the garden cemetery. Those came about at a time when they acted like parks, and they have fountains and pathways and areas. I work at an independent and assisted living community in Granite Bay, and we have a gentleman who's 100 plus, and he grew up in Cambridge, and he was telling me one day that his family used to go to the Mount Auburn Cemetery as an outing on Sunday afternoons, and they had a picnic, and he and his siblings played there, and it was years and years before he realized it was a cemetery. So just some interesting history along with our nation's cemeteries. The urban cemeteries typically are, the straight rows, and they have a completely different look and feel from the more rural cemeteries. We've already talked about the military cemeteries. And then we have the memorial or the lawn park cemeteries with the flat stones. The stones are smaller, so there's less information on the tombstone itself. They don't have the feel necessarily of an outdoor museum or art gallery with all the different styles, but the records are still good, and still certainly something to use in our research, of course. And then when you're in a cemetery with a lot of different styles of tombstones, it's nice to know how the style and the material changed over the years and how the lettering changed. And sometimes that helps you date a tombstone or marker. We're going to jump into types of cemetery records. And there are a lot of different records. So when you contact the cemetery office, make sure that you ask all the different types of records that they may have available. They probably, if it's an operating cemetery and there is still an office, they probably have a record of who purchased the plot again and who they buried there. There are often the actual deed, there are deed maps, there are plat records, plot records and maps, burial permits, grave opening records. The lot cards, I think lot cards are something that people tend to forget about. Those can have a lot of good information. A removal permit, if someone was buried there and then transferred to another cemetery or another resting place, those records are typically available. And then often they have the records from either the funeral home and or the monument company, typically the monument company, because that's who's delivering the marker or the stone to them. Apologize, my slides are not sliding as they should. This is an early copy from a monument company. This is from 1925, and this is an individual, Ira Carl, who purchased a stone for her parents, Thomas and Clara. And you can see that this gives the sketch or the outline of the stone that she is purchasing. She paid $250 for it. She lived in, or it's going to a cemetery, or the monument company is in, it's not going to a cemetery there, the monument company is in Elizabeth, Indiana. And this gives you an idea of how they pronounced Elizabeth, because they've written it as Elizabeth. And so if you find this and you don't know where the monument company is, maybe you just get a hold of this record and you look for Elizabeth, you're not going to find it. It's Elizabeth with an E. But this is really good information. It gives her address, her signature is on here, and the dimensions of the stone. And here it is, Thomas Carl and Clara, her mother. And this is that same stone several years later. And when you use sites like Find a Grave and other sites, and you're looking up photos of the tombstones, it's always good to try and get earlier photos or maybe later photos. This one is, of course, years later, and something has been planted or is growing on its own and is about to cover the stone. And we'll talk later about what to take to the cemetery. But this is one of those times that you may have to cut back a little bit of the foliage so you can see the tombstone, photograph it, and read it. This again is paperwork. This is from East Washington. This is Indianapolis, Indiana, and it's the Indiana Cemetery Corporation that owns this cemetery. And you can see that the family bought four lots or plots there at the cemetery, and lot 141. So this gives us the actual location. It shows the purchasers at the top, Harold B. and Elizabeth Carl, and at the bottom, it lists two other individuals, James Carl and Rosalind Bell. So interesting that on this one document, you now have four people to figure out what their relationship is to each other. And if you don't already know, it's additional people to research. And before I forget, everything that we look at, and we all know this already, but everything that we look at in our genealogy research, every record should give us a clue to more research. There should be something that we say, oh, now that I look at this, I'm going to make a note to do some further research. Now I need to go and find, I'm going to want to know why they selected this cemetery. I'm going to want to know who all these people are. Why did they buy four plots? These are now questions that we want to work on. This is one of the stones for those four plots that they purchased. We're going to switch gears here. This is a, whoops, didn't mean to do that, touched the wrong thing. This is for Elizabeth Westlake, and you can see how early this is. This is 1867. It shows that her date of death is August 19th, and this is a pre-printed form. This is early for something like this. This is just, I just look at this and I think, what a wonderful find this is. The place of death is New York State, and look at this, cause of death, falling from car on Erie Railroad. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Elizabeth fell off the train, right? She fell off the train and died. And so several things with this. It tells us at the bottom that she's going to Cypress Hills. But back to the falling off the car on the Erie Railroad, what is this going to bring to mind for us? We right away, before we go on and do anything else with this, I think we want to make a notation that we're going to look at newspaper articles around this time. That should be a newsworthy event, a young woman falling off the train. We're going to want to check the newspapers around the place that the accident, we hope it was an accident, hope she wasn't pushed, around the area that this happened, near the area where she lived, her hometown newspaper, and see what the articles say. It's going to mention family members. It's going to give us more information about the situation and that family. We also are going to want to check coroner's records. We want to make a note to ourselves that, oh, you know, did they call out the coroner? That would seem a likely thing to do. Following along with Elizabeth, now we have a record from the Cypress Hills Cemetery, and look at this, now her age is listed at 17. So she's no longer 21. They have her listed at 17. We know the funeral is listed on here, and there's a map of the section. She is in section 9, and it shows clearly on that map. So we have a little more information about her without even going to the cemetery. This is a fairly early, this is 1903 transit permit that gives us a little more information about this individual. So before we even go to the cemetery, we can collect a lot of good information. And as with anything else, we don't want to stop with one record, one document. We want to find as much as we can, as much supporting information and as many different types of records as we can. We're going to look at a death certificate here in a little bit, but these are some things that are out of the book of the Sunny Side of Genealogy. And for those of you who have been researching a long time, you probably have read this or you have this on your bookshelf. And some of the things that have been put on death certificates as causes of death, obviously not amusing at the time or to the family, but looking back, it's like, oh my goodness, you can't believe that a coroner or a physician or somebody would put this on a death certificate. But it brings up the fact that death certificates are not always correct. And so here's a death certificate of an individual who lived in Indiana. He went across the Ohio River to Kentucky to visit his son, and while he was there, he died. So who gives the information for the death certificate? You know, the death certificate is one of those rare things that, you know, the person giving the information is asked questions about things that sometimes they know nothing about. And so this individual knew where his father died and he knew the date. But if you look at the other information, birthplace is Oldham County, Indiana. There is no Oldham County, Indiana, and never has been. So who knows where he came up with that. But you're giving information at a time of stress, at a time of grief, and sometimes you don't know, you think you know, or you're just giving information. The name of the maiden name of the mother is incorrect. And there were 2 funeral homes to choose from, and even got the funeral home incorrect. So Rogers Campground, though, that's where the Carl's stone that we just looked at is, and we're going to visit that in a little bit. So keep in mind that when you look at these records, and as we saw with Elizabeth Westlake, everything isn't always accurate, but these are excellent records that you're going to want to pull clues from and look at things a little bit closer, as on this one, which is not a copy of the original, and we always want to get to the original record, right? This is from years ago, before everything, well, and everything is not online, but before a lot was online. this was requested. And so somebody sat down and typed it out, and you can see kind of a little up from the middle of the form, age at death, 842 years of age, not very likely. One thing, even when things are photocopied and available online, some things that are not available, some things that just didn't get scanned are the additional information. And this was in Indiana, in this county was called personal data file. And look at all the additional information that Park County had on her that was on the back of that death certificate. And this gives the place of burial. She's at North Union Cemetery. This gives the name of the undertaker along with family information. So great information for us as researchers. So what if we don't know where the cemetery is? How are we going to find the cemetery? There are lots of ways to find cemeteries, lots and lots of ways. It can be a little time consuming, but there are lots of ways. The death certificate typically will tell you if it's prior to the time we have death certificates or you can't find the death certificate. Look for every obituary you can find, and often there's more than one. There are lots of maps that list cemeteries, and you can track from, if you know the land, you can look at where the land is located and find the cemeteries that are close by. There are the wonderful USGS maps, the land ownership maps. We're going to look at a copy of a land ownership map in just a little bit. We have the Sanborn maps if you're in an urban area. You can ask individuals who live in the area. You can read the county histories. You can look at the county records. There are cemetery ledgers and survey books in a lot of courthouses. Don't forget your township trustee. If you're researching in an area, Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest states have township trustees, the county historians. Don't forget your county historical society and museum. They are a treasure trove of information. City directories. When you are researching your family, when you do your city directory research, you definitely are going to want to list the cemeteries that are listed in that directory. Keep a copy of that for the time that your family lived there. Keep a list of the funeral homes, the mortuary companies, the religious organizations. Those are all going to be clues as to the possibilities of where your people might be buried. The Daughters of the American Revolution in the, I believe, 1940s, 1950s, almost every chapter in the United States had a project of transcribing their local cemeteries, the stones in their local cemeteries, and those are available in Washington, D.C. Most of those are scanned and online, but the originals are in Washington, D.C. at the library. Look at newspaper announcements, notices, funeral notices. Obviously, family correspondence and diaries are also a good place to find the cemetery location. There are lots of special collections online and at university libraries. Your local library, we talked about historical societies, local archives. The local funeral homes sometimes have histories for that region, especially in the rural, smaller areas. They tend to know the cemeteries that are no longer in existence and are tucked away down the county windy road. Military records sometimes will let you know, sometimes it's in the family Bible. Contact the local genealogy society in that area and see if they have someone to do research for you for a donation. The religious newspapers, don't forget the religious newspapers and church records. And then if you're not using NUCMUC, the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections, that's just fun for all sorts of things, but that is sometimes a great way to find obscure records that maybe traveled away from the area. This is a map of southern Indiana, and I don't know if you can see, I don't think my pointer is going to work on here, but down towards the little tip at the bottom, there's a little place next to where it says 111 in the circle. That is Evans Landing, and that's where Rogers Campground is located. And there's nothing in Evans Landing. I don't think there's ever been anything in Evans Landing, and they've never had a newspaper. So when you think of terms of looking for newspaper articles, obituaries, funeral notices, and so forth, I like to get a map out and draw a 50-mile radius, maybe 75 miles, depends on how rural the area is. The closest to Evans Landing, if you look up the map and go straight up, you see a little place called Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is their largest close town. So Elizabeth did have a newspaper. We remember Elizabeth from the Monument Company for the bill of sale that we just looked at. And going up a little farther and to the left where Highway 64 in red goes across is the county seat. This is all in Harrison County, Indiana. The county seat is Corydon. So when somebody in Evans Landing or any of these other little areas died, typically the family sent the information for the obituary to the Elizabeth newspaper. Sometimes New Middleton had a newspaper, and to Corydon. And you always want to read the newspaper in the county seat. That's where they're going to post that probate is open, or so-and-so has died, and if they owe you money or you owe them money, please contact so-and-so. It's going to give you all that information. But you also are going to want the obituary from every newspaper because it's likely going to be different. Newspapers printed information as they had space available. And so one newspaper might print the full obituary, another paper might edit it. Family members may send obituaries, different obituaries to different newspapers. So you're going to want to read all of them. This is a death notice, and I apologize. This is from an old newspaper and an old microfilm, and it's a little fuzzy, but it's for Benjamin Carl, and he's in Mount Olive, Indiana, and this gives the date of the funeral, tells the cemetery, and it also at the bottom, it might be too fuzzy to read, but it says that it is in charge of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And so again, these are clues that we want to collect and investigate further, because this is a cemetery that is no longer in operation. So if we can't find much in the cemetery records, we now have another place to look for information. We can see if we can find the GAR records. This is an early newspaper notice, and this is from the Leavenworth Arena newspaper. And at first glance, it looks like this individual died in Patoka, Crawford County, Iowa, on the 20th of the year 1838 here. For Mrs. Charity Land, and an advanced age. At that time, she was probably 50, right? They don't give that information here. And this is an early death notice for a newspaper. Everything you look at should be evaluated and analyzed and looked at 3 or 4 times, because this is not Crawford County, Iowa. This is Crawford County, Indiana. So if you are trying to find, if you just have this, and you don't know the state, and you're looking in Crawford County, Iowa, and of course, everyone has a Crawford County, and there is a Crawford County, Iowa. I don't know about Patoka, but there is a Crawford County, Iowa. You are going to be way off base. So We always want to make sure that we truly know what we're looking at and look at things through the eyes of that time period and not today. And I don't think that Iowa was even actually a state yet at that time. So we really want to make sure that we know how we're using the information and that we are interpreting it correctly. We're back to our Ira Carl. She's the one who bought the monument for her parents that is in that Rogers campground. And this stone is a stone that she purchased for herself. This is also at Rogers Campground in Evans Landing, that teeny tiny little spot down in southern Indiana on the Ohio River. And she never married. And so she purchased this for herself, had it installed, left instructions for the family to fill in the death date. And they buried her in Indianapolis. And so you see on the right-hand side, it says Sister Ira. Well, here she is. They didn't bury her there. So sometimes even when you find the stone, that isn't where the burial records are going to be because the person was never buried there. So sometimes you have to look a little further afield. This is one of the land ownership maps that I mentioned earlier, and this shows some of the creeks and the rivers, but you can see it shows the cemeteries. There's Clear Run Cemetery, Hartman Cemetery. There's several cemeteries listed on this. And back in the day when people used transparencies a lot, they're a little harder to find now, but you could make a photocopy of this on a clear transparency. And then you could make a photocopy of the pages of the land ownership map that showed where individuals lived. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there are some yellow highlighted areas, and that's where some of my Bell family lived. And then you can look around and see how close or how far away they were from some of the cemeteries. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were buried in the closest cemetery, but those are good places to try if you don't know the cemetery. And this is a little larger view. So you can see more of the family and some of the cemeteries that are close by. This is an early 1919 Plymouth, Indiana, teeny tiny little place, city directory. And you can see that it lists different lodges and organizations. There's the GAR at the bottom, Ladies of the Mercedes right in front of that. And so you can go Order of the Moose, you can go on up and see all of these different organizations listed. And if you see that in the directory where your family lives, keep a copy of this as well, because if they were members, there could be good information through the organization, or maybe at that time they had a cemetery for their members. And again, a city directory listing the funeral homes in the area at the time. This is Elmira in New York, 1935. And we have a handful of cemeteries that were in existence at that time. And the handout has a little more information about researching funeral homes. Here again is a city directory, and at the very bottom left, they start listing cemeteries, and it goes up to the second column on the left-hand side. So there's a handful of cemeteries, and then they start listing religious organizations going from there. And so, of course, you're going to want copies of both the cemeteries that were available and the religious organizations, which ones were conducting business at that time, which cemeteries were open. And just a quick note on funeral homes. Funeral homes typically used to be a family business, and it was passed on from generation to generation. and they kept the records. The same families would return to the same funeral home generation after generation as well. And so it's only been fairly recently where the next generation wanted to do other things. They didn't want to follow the family tradition of being in the funeral home business. But sometimes when those funeral homes were purchased, the acquiring company kept those records or passed them on to a historical society or other repository that would maintain them. Another thing to look for in the city directories is they frequently list the deaths of the year of the publication, or actually it's the previous year. They gather the information the previous year and then go to print. So this is Columbus City, and these are the deaths from July 1, 1888 to July 1, 1889. And so if you know, and it gives the exact death date for these individuals, which is just wonderful information. And then you can go to the section of the city directory and see what cemeteries were in business at that time. You can also check funeral homes, the monument companies, the newspapers, the religious organizations, the fraternal organizations. City directories are just wonderful. So you can get all of that and then just start doing your research. Coroner's records, I mentioned coroner records when we were looking at the paperwork on Elizabeth Westlake, and this is a description of some coroner's records. This was from the US GenWeb project, San Francisco, many years ago, and this gives the items and personal articles that were found on the deceased at the time, and it lists the individual that they were given to. And so this is just wonderful information that doesn't necessarily tell you the cemetery, but it gives you a person to contact on the deceased's behalf. And so you might need to track both people. Just great information. So we're going to get to finally to visiting the cemetery. So as we've discussed, we're going to do as much research as we can before we ever head out to the cemetery. We want everything that we can do from home or the library. We want to take advantage of that and get that information gathered before we take off for the cemetery. And we're going to want to certainly contact the cemetery office or whoever holds the records for that cemetery. Years ago, my brother and I went to a rural area in Indiana, and the little church was still there, but it was no longer operating. The people in the area used it for different events, and the little church graveyard was still there, but no one had been buried there for years and years and years. And we finally tracked down that the daughter of the last church secretary had all of the records in her basement, just sitting there. And so you never know who has those records. You never know who the keeper of the cemetery records could turn out to be, almost anyone. So we definitely need to do our research. Before you go, you're certainly going to want to prepare, as you do for any research trip, list all of the surnames, collateral names, variant spellings, date ranges, so that you have all of that with you. And of course, now we can keep all that on our phone and we are set to go. I also like to research the history of the cemetery itself. So once I've found the cemetery and I'm planning my trip, or even if I'm not planning my trip, if I can't go in person, I want to research the cemetery. That Rogers Campground Cemetery used to be called a campground. It was sort of a gathering place in the late 1800s, early 1900s for the people in that area, for all sorts of things. And they alternated between a traveling Methodist minister and a traveling Presbyterian minister who would alternate Sundays. And a lot of the local people, my family included, just went every Sunday. That was their religious offering, and they didn't seem to care which minister, who was preaching. They didn't care which organization. They went every Sunday, and their records are in both the Methodist records and the Presbyterian records. So knowing a little bit about how that cemetery came about, what that land was used for, helped in further research and helped in finding additional information. And then we're going to talk a little bit about packing our cemetery kit. So not that you need to be told how to dress to go to a cemetery, but wear comfortable clothes. And I don't like slithery things and bugs. So I like socks and closed-toed shoes and long pants and long sleeves. And I don't care how hot and humid it is, because the bugs will come out and find you immediately. You're definitely going to want gloves, no matter how hot and humid it may be, because you may have to be cutting back some brush or clearing out an area. And certainly you're going to want a hat and a windbreaker or a jacket, depending, of course, on the season and the climate and what you expect in the weather. Items to take to the cemetery. Some people still like to use a traditional camera. Most people use the camera on their cell phone. You might want to make sure that you have the Ancestry app or another genealogy app on your phone, or your information in your notes on your phone, but go with all of your information. If there is a cemetery office, make sure you have their phone number. You can always Google it, but it's easier just to have it in case you have to call them for some reason. If you're going to a rural cemetery or a cemetery where your cell phone service might be a little spotty, take travel Wi-Fi. I like to overdo, so instead of just taking photographs, I make notes, and I like to record the information just in case there's a glitch, because I don't want to find out once I get home that I lost my photos, or they're just a glare from the sun or whatever. So I want to make sure that if one thing glitches, if I lose my notes, I've got photos. If the photos don't turn out, I've recorded it on a device. I've got a backup. Always take a flashlight. That helps in reading a stone that is difficult to read. It also helps you look kind of under the foliage before you just step up to a stone. A walking stick can help you navigate uneven ground. It also is something that from afar you can kind of poke into the shrubbery if it's grown close to your marker or tombstone to make sure nothing slithers out. Take some water. I be careful about food. You don't want to, make a mess, obviously damage the stone, but you're going to be there a while. So you're going to want some snacks. You're going to want a health bar or something. Certainly take your sunscreen, your bug repellent. And if I forget to say later, don't go to rural cemeteries by yourself. That just isn't safe. And also, while you're photographing, somebody else can be recording, either taking notes or sketching or recording that information. Take aspirin. You're likely to get a headache, and I'm not medically trained and I am not giving medical advice, but I have also had insect bites and bee stings. I put a little water on it, rub the aspirin in, and that keeps me going. I'm certainly not going to leave the cemetery in the middle of research because the bee found me. Take aluminum foil, a small spray bottle, a soft brush, and I mean a soft brush, something you would use on your face, a small soft little whisk broom, cleaning brush, some garden shears or snippers, and your tombstone rubbing supplies. And we're not going to have time to talk about true rubbing, tombstone rubbings, but you can get that from other sources. Back eons ago, back before COVID, back before 9/11, you used to be able to travel with all of this. You could take anything on a plane. Now, some of this, it's more convenient and you just have to purchase it when you get to your destination if the cemetery isn't local. But these are all items that are going to come in very, very handy. This is we're going to change gears here a little bit. This is a tombstone in the middle of a cornfield. You can see all the corn in the background. You can see a different style and a much older tombstone directly behind this and off to the left. You can see one that's sort of leaning. It's obviously an older style. It looks older. This isn't the best photo, but you can tell that the marker for James Daniel Bell was probably put there much later than 1920. And so when you see something like this, you're going to want to ask yourself questions. What monument company made this? Who paid for it? Who ordered it? Whose idea was it to put this here? Why did they put it? Was this, obviously this was probably still the family land, but what time frame was this put here? Because it looks much newer than 1920. So when we're visiting the cemetery and making our notes, we also want to list our questions. It's, when we look at this and you're standing there, you can't help but say, oh, well, how odd is this? This is new. This is not in keeping with the other stones here. And you can kind of see, the grass has been cut back a little bit. If this is let go and nobody's maintaining this, you're going to need your snippers and your shears to cut enough away to where you can photograph and read the stone. Also take notes about what the whole area tells you. We can tell a lot about Selma just from, and again, this is a photo that is just a terrible photo, and I apologize. It was dusk. It didn't come out clear to begin with, and then you make a copy and get it on a slide. But you can see the stones on top of her marker where people have visited, and in the front, that's a cat. You can kind of see the face of the cat and the ears and the stones. So Selma and her cat are right there, and obviously this tells us a little more about Selma as an individual. This is private property in Ohio, and this at one time was owned by my ancestors. That's my uncle. We tracked down this family plot by doing our land research, found the land, visited the people currently living there. And they said, oh yeah, they had seen some stones out on the land, and they had close to 100 acres at the time, and they just let their cattle run through there. And so you can see the condition of the stones. This is a whole nother talk. This is, we got a monument company and a preservation group to come out and help clean it up and get things back in order a little bit. They let us fence it. We have a scout group that maintains it, but it is not impossible to find these family plots that are still there on the land that our ancestors and our families no longer have anything to do with. The family that owns this land turned out to be very, very nice and very cooperative and wanted to preserve this. So we're back to visiting the cemetery, or still visiting the cemetery. Definitely, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to thank the people who help you. I used to, when I lived in the Bay Area, when I visited Indiana and Ohio, I flew out of San Francisco, and those were in the days where it was easy to get a direct flight. And I would buy fresh sourdough bread because the person at the courthouse in Rockville, Indiana loved San Francisco sourdough bread. And that was my thank you gift. I would purchase that, and I tried my best to go right from the airport right to the courthouse and deliver her bread, and she was just thrilled. And she was my assistant researcher. She'd find my family and she would call me or mail things to me just out of the goodness of her heart. So we always want to be appreciative of that. Obviously, when we are at the cemetery, we want to record everything: the name and the location of the cemetery, the directions. If it's a rural cemetery, make sure that you get the directions down. Even though we can GPS it today, sometimes GPS takes you all over the place. describe the condition. I like to plot out the section, the family section, or the area where my family is buried, who's next to who, how many rows. I like to take a photo and sketch it out. Record the information from the gravestone exactly as it's written. If it doesn't come out on the photograph, make sure you write it down. And by the way, if you have digital photos, when you get home, you can play with those with different software. You can change the color. You can do all kinds of things to help read those a little bit better. And then obviously we want to record the neighboring gravestones. Who's buried next to them? Is it family? Is it so, you know, it's probably somebody from their social group, depending on how far back you go. And sometimes those names are going to come in handy down the road. You definitely want to check all sides of the tombstone. Sometimes there's a different family or additional information on the back. Sometimes the stone carver signs the side. Sometimes there's information on the side, so make sure you look all the way around. When you're photographing, get a photo of the entrance of the cemetery, any signage that they have in the area or at the entrance or in the area of where your family's buried. As I just mentioned, we want the immediate section, the general area. If it's a small cemetery, I try to get the whole cemetery. You know, because if you're in a rural area, you don't know who's over on the other side. And if you've traveled across country, you don't want to get home and then realize, oh, somebody else is buried in that same cemetery and I need that information. That information is going to be important to me in my research. Make a rubbing if it's safe to do so. If it's a very thin stone or if it's damaged, not in good condition, don't take the chance of breaking that stone or inflicting more damage on that tombstone. Don't do the rubbing. But if it's a good solid stone, it's kind of fun to have a traditional tombstone rubbing. Don't remove all the algae. That actually helps protect it from the elements. So you can brush away the bird droppings and, you know, the twigs and some of the dirt and so forth, but don't scrub it clean. And of course, we all know to leave the cemetery in better condition than we find it. Don't, you know, we're researchers. We're not going to leave our debris behind. We're going to gather it up and take it with us. If the stone is not legible, you go through all this, you find the cemetery, you get there, and the tombstone that's in the spot where your ancestor is just absolutely not legible. That's so disheartening. You know, you just stand there and it's like, you know, I traveled all this way and here I am and I can't read a thing. There are a lot of different ways to bring out at least some of what is on that stone. Sometimes just looking at it from the side, from the top, from, you know, different angles, you're able to read a little more. Take photos from all angles. And as I said, once you get home and you play around with those photos, it's very likely that images are going to appear that you would not be able to see in person. Lightly brush it with that soft brush that you took, the brush for your face. Just brush away some of the debris and the dirt, and you probably will be able to read a little more. We're going to look at an example of an aluminum foil rubbing in just a minute. Shine, you know, the flashlight that's on our list of things to take, shine the flashlight on it. And sometimes that illuminates it enough to where you can make out the wording. Or reflect light on the stone with a mirror or something else that will reflect the light. We talked about making the rubbing. Sometimes if you just spray it lightly with water, that brings out the wording. People in the past have used flour, chalk, shaving cream. Please don't do that. That damages the stone. Flour in particular is awful. You never get all the flour off, and then when it rains, it just becomes gooey like it does in our kitchen, and then that traps moisture and other things. We don't want to do that to our tombstone. So try not to put any foreign substance on the tombstone at all. So here's our tombstone that We can see a little bit, but it's very hard to read. This is a very difficult stone. There's been a lot of wear from the elements on this, and it's very difficult to read. But you can see that if we just hold up our aluminum foil and very gently rub across it and push where we feel indentations or push a little bit where you feel raised lettering, you can see how Sarah E., wife of, it's not as legible as we would really like, but it is considerably sharper, easier to read. This is much better. And then when you take that away or look at it from different angles, you can see more and more. And you might want to use both sides of the foil. You know, if it's a bright, sunshiny day, you might want the matte finish of the foil out so it doesn't reflect as much. If it's an overcast day, you might want the shiny part out so you can see it a little better. Play with both sides and see what works best for you. Actually going to the cemetery or getting copies of photos of the tombstone is so, not only is it just wonderful to be there in person, but if you can't, still try to get a copy of the tombstone itself. This particular one tells us that this person was a native of Canada and died in San Francisco. This is our Benjamin Carl again. On the right is Benjamin Carl, and this is the tombstone that the Grand Army of the Republic got for him from the government. This was his Civil War original tombstone, and on the left is his brother Frederick, who no longer had a stone. And back in the late 1990s, my uncle ordered this and had it installed, ordered it from the VA and had that installed. So you can kind of see the differences and the similarities. This one I love, Mrs. Rachel Clank, formerly Mrs. Ewell. So if we didn't know beforehand that she was formerly Mrs. Ewell, this gives us additional research, additional information to research and look into. Don't forget the calendar change when you're looking at early tombstones. I'm not going to turn this into a presentation on the calendar change, but just keep that in mind when you are looking at early tombstones. Make sure you know what the dates really mean. This is Thomas Jefferson's obelisk, and he designed this himself. And you can see down at the bottom, it says born April 12th, 1743 OS. That's old style. That's the old calendar system. So keep in mind that between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar changes, you know, England and England's colonies and possessions didn't change right away, and neither did some other countries. It took a while. So make sure that when you're looking at dates, you know exactly what you're looking at. The same with this one. Here lies the body of William Gooding, son of Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Mary Gooding, aged 17, died January 22nd. And way down at the bottom, it's hard to see because the grass is coming up and it's spaced out, but it says it's 1730 and then it's 8/9. So that's the double dating between the years of, was the first of the year January, was it March 25th? They're giving you the double dating there. So just something to be aware of. Something else to be aware of is the Quaker months. The Quakers only used the numbers. And so you can see it's fairly easy on the top right to see that it says 8th month. So they didn't use the names of the months. And so again, you have to kind of know where you are in the calendar. And then also make sure if you find any symbols or symbolism on the tombstone, look up the meaning. There's a lot of symbolism that is used, not so much anymore, but in earlier days, a lot of symbolism is used. And so you're definitely going to want to look that up. And then of course, on the right, the photo of the tombstone on the right, is the Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks, and that's a traditional thing that you will see. And this is the Daughters of Rebecca. This is a common that you will see for those individuals. And the cemetery that somebody is buried in, and certainly their tombstone, tells you so much about the family, that individual. It's more than just a final resting place. So try to take in everything, and again, make your notes and think about, why did they do this? Why did they choose this cemetery? Why did they choose this monument? Who made the decision? That tells you so much more about your family than just a burial place and the information of the death. So I hope you've picked up some good tips on our cemetery tour. Cemeteries are fascinating and gorgeous, and this closing shot, I think, shows all the different styles and time periods that we can research. And I hope that I find it fascinating, and I hope that you do too. Thank you for joining me on our cemetery tour today.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And now we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. We've already gotten some questions in chat. So I'm going to read off some of those questions, and then we're going to allow people to unmute themselves and ask questions as well.
Okay.
So let's see, I've got some questions to start with. From early on, from Ann Burroughs, my great-great-grandfather, 1816 to 1899, was buried with his first wife and four children, in parentheses, instead of his second wife, 11 children. Was that typical?
Yes, that is not uncommon. I love that comment. Whoever submitted that, thank you for sharing. This is one of my favorite topics, and I could do like a 4-hour presentation. And one of the slides I took out is, I have a family member that the reverse happened. The individual was married, had 4 children, and then married his second wife. They had no children, and when he died, his name is on 2 different stones. The children of the first marriage sort of just bulldozed in and commandeered and did their own thing. And that is very, you find that all the time, where people with children from different marriages, everybody's like, no, he should be buried with mom, and the other family's like, no, he should be married with this wife. And sometimes you find the name on several different tombstones depending on how many spouses. So that's a good catch, and yes, that's common.
Okay, here's another question. Where are coroner's records?
Oh, good question. Coroner's records can be like a lot of records. They could be on a lot of different levels. They can be on the state level. Typically, though, you're going to find them at the local courthouse for that county or township, where the township records are kept, or on a town in New England. They're going to be on the town level. You're going to find them in those repositories. A lot of them are online, and so if you use Family Search or Ancestry, you can find them there.
I would also like to mention that we have some books of coroner's records in our genealogy collection here at the Sacramento Public Library. They're quite interesting to read through.
Oh, great. Oh, I'm glad you have. Yes, they're wonderful, wonderful records. They're fascinating.
Let's see. Asking about the name of the book, The Sunny Side of Genealogy. I think that was the name, The Sunny Side of Genealogy.
Yes.
And I posted, our library actually has it in the genealogy collection, and you can get it on Amazon. Yeah. Devora Weathers asked, why take Tums white powdered to cemetery?
Oh, that is on the handout. Thank you for asking that, Devora. So, so I've been told by a couple of preservationists, and I've taken it off my slides for my actual PowerPoint presentation. I have been told by a couple of preservationists that if you have to use any substance that is the least acidic and will not damage the stone all that much. I personally, even though it's on the handout, I personally, I'd rather you take it yourself if you get an upset stomach in the cemetery rather than put it on the stone. I would use all of the other things that I mentioned. And I personally wouldn't use it, even though I listed it there. But I have been told that if you dust it lightly and make sure you spritz lots of water and don't rub, but spritz lots of water to get it off, that it's the least likely to cause damage to a stone.
Interesting. Okay, and then following up on that in terms of reading headstones, what is good software to use to try to make a photo of a headstone clearer to read?
Oh, my email is on my handout. If you email me, I'll look it up. I just did, not just, but I did some research a while back. I was going to change software. If you email me, or I can send that to you, Dave, and you can pass it on to everybody. But if whoever asks the question emails me, I will send that out. There's a lot of different ones, and like a lot of things, they do some things really well, and then others do other things really well. So sorry, I can't answer that right off my head.
Okay, yes, you can send it to me, and and if you're interested, you can email contact@saclibrary.org, and I'll be glad to pass the information on.
Great, great.
Let's see, what other questions do we have now? Back to the double dating. What do you mean double dating, and how do you know they did it on the tombstone? I understand about Jefferson, but not the other one.
Okay, so the other one, quickly, and again, I don't want to turn it into a calendar change presentation, but I appreciate the question, and it's important. There were different times, some countries and during some time started their new year January 1st, and others started March 25th. And in some countries, it went back and forth. And so if something occurred between January and March to indicate that, well, you may think it's the next year already, they did a double date. So some people have thought, oh, they didn't know if it was this year or the next year. Well, that's kind of true, but I mean, they knew what year they were in, but they didn't, it depends on when the first day of the year occurs. Hopefully that makes sense. And you can do a lot of research on, in fact, Steve Morse, I think, has posted something on double dating and the calendar year. It's one of the presentations that I give as well. There's a lot of good information out there, and it goes back to the change from the Gregorian or from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, and the change of when countries accepted that the first day of the new year occurred.
Okay, great. Let's see. Not really a question, but Rebecca Corson says that she's going to Ohio and will use this information.
Oh, great.
Should be a
Happy
good trip.
surfing.
Yeah. And some other nice thank yous, an interesting presentation. Excellent presentation. Okay. What is Nukmuk?
Oh, Nukmuk. Nukmuk is the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections. It is an index of repositories and an index of their collections. So it's was started by and is run by the Library of Congress. And it started out as an indexing project for repositories unable, without the means to index their own collection. Now, a lot of the information is scanned and online, And the beauty of it is, well, there's lots of great information and lots of uses, but for genealogists, one of the benefits is that it's a great way to find information that migrated geographically to a place that you would not think to look for it. For instance, a very early tax list from the early 1800s from Southern Indiana is in the library at Yale University. Well, if you're researching in Southern Indiana, you would never look at Yale University, but it's in their collection and indexed on NUCMUC, and you can find it there. So let's say, for instance, a circuit rider is in Indiana and has is the circuit riders, that information was their personal information. So he has the death record or information on your ancestor's death. And then he moves on to Ohio. He takes that record with him. And then he continues moving west, and maybe he dies in Missouri. And luckily that information gets to the Historical Society. Hopefully his family doesn't burn it. And it gets to the Historical Society in Iowa, but you're back in Indiana looking for it, or Ohio, maybe. And if that collection is indexed in NUCMUC, then you're able to find it. And so a cemetery that's no longer in operation, who knows where those early records are? And again, they may have migrated states away. And so if you research for rural cemetery or cemeteries of a particular area, it might come up in NUCMUC. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't too long-winded.
Let's see, we have Rachel Aguilera giving a big thank you to Mount Auburn Cemetery, which you mentioned. They've sent her pictures and burial information from her ancestors back to around the 1860s. She lives in California, so everything was done either before computers with plain old snail mail.
And I will say that those most people want to be helpful, but those older and historical well-known cemeteries, they love to share their history. And so I would urge people to definitely reach out and contact them. They love to hear that you have a connection, and they love to share their history and be helpful. That's exciting. I'm glad she has a connection to that. It's a neat cemetery.
Let's see. Here's another question. Can you please talk more about headstone styles differences?
So the earlier stones were thinner, more porous. Obviously, with the passage of time and the fact that they're thinner, they haven't stood up as well. The styles have, over the years, have become less ornate. And so it tells us a little less about the person, but the stones are hardier and last a little longer. There's some excellent books, some of them in the bibliography, and the source and different ones will give you a nice breakdown of when Roman lettering was used, the different styles of the stone, the material of the stone, the symbolism that sort of came in and out of fashion. So you're definitely, once you know kind of the geographic area, well, not once look at the geographic area that your ancestors and family was in, and then start researching the style and the material used. It's also interesting to look up particular stone carvers, because a lot of stone carvers had their own style. And there are great write-ups in some of the county histories about the stone carvers. So don't forget them.
Let's see. Beth Doherty tells us that she has a handout about the calendar change. It's from a presentation by Janice Sellers. She can send it to me, and if you'd like it, you can send me an email at contact@saclibrary.org and ask for it, and I'll send it to you. So we can do that, a handout about the calendar change.
Oh, that's great. I'm happy to send you mine as well. Yeah, that's something that all researchers should just keep in mind when you're looking at those early dates, so that you know exactly what dates you're working with and using. Yeah, thanks, Beth.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. We can just send them both. That would be super. Let's see, more thank yous. Let's see. Oh, someone. Okay, good. Go. Any suggestions for an abandoned cemetery? From Amanda Miller. Amanda, you might want to expand on that. I'm not sure quite what sort of suggestions you're asking for. How to handle an abandoned cemetery? How to find one?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I found an abandoned cemetery with some of my ancestors, and I don't even know how to go about reporting it to I guess the county. I don't know what to do. It's not taken care of. It's not maintained.
Okay, great question. And I think you're on the right track. I would contact the county and see if there's a cemetery commission. Some jurisdictions have a cemetery commission. And so I would contact them, and then I would see if there were any preservation groups. I would check with the local historical society. Maybe the local genealogy society would like to adopt it. Here in Sacramento, the old Sacramento City Cemetery has a wonderful group of volunteers that do things. And then on the handout under websites is the website for the Association of Gravestone Studies, and they are great for all types of information. But I would contact them and ask them if they have members in the area, because they specialize in preservation.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Good luck with that. And thanks for caring about that cemetery.
All right, here's another question. How far from ground zero do you look on maps?
Oh, good question. I would say as far, as far as needed, which doesn't really answer your question. If you're looking for the location of a cemetery and you know that somebody lived in a particular area, they could have family that is paying for it, or they were really close to across a state line or a county line or a couple of states away. And so I think knowing the family members and who is important to them, which is easier said than done, it is really going to be helpful. In the case of the individual that I showed you, Ira Carl, who has that stone that she put down herself all the way in southern Indiana. Indianapolis is right in the center of the state, and she's buried there. But knowing that she lived with a nephew at the time of her death, and he was right outside of Indianapolis, so he buried her there, and he knew about the other family members buried there. So I think knowing about the other family members and their location helps you look at cemeteries in those other areas. And the same with obituaries. You're going to want to look in the newspapers where all the family lived, because those obituaries could be sent all over. And just because the local one may not have mentioned the cemetery, but the one farther away may have.
I've just noticed in the chat that Don Hayden has posted a link to the NUCMUC site. So that should be a good link.
Thank you.
For everyone wondering about that.
It's on the handout as well, the NUCMUC site.
Oh, wonderful. That's a great handout. It has a ton of stuff. Very good one. Let's see, I just posted the handout again. And I know some people are unable to download those. So just give me an email at contact@saclibrary.org and I'll send it to you. And I'm going to.
Dave, are you looking for hands?
Oh, I'm sorry. I haven't been looking for hands yet.
Oh.
I have a question too, or thought.
Yeah, Elizabeth has had her hand up longer than I have, but I have a comment, so I'll wait till
Okay.
Elizabeth does hers.
Okay. Elizabeth, go ahead then.
Yeah, when Pamela mentioned about looking at stones around your family stones or a particular stone, it reminded me of when my great aunt asked my mother if she and my dad were going to be buried back in Wisconsin in the family plot at Mound Cemetery in Racine. Because if they weren't, she was planning on opening it, the family plot, to the Welch Society because she wanted other Welch. She was 100% Welch, my great aunt. She wanted other Welch people to have the opportunity, or friends that were Welch, to be buried with the family. So that was kind of a good point, that they might not be related to your family, but they might be friends and have connections even back to the old country, like many of my great aunt's friends did.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, Anne, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, well, I have a comment.
Okay.
My great-great-grandfather and his first wife are buried in the middle of a soybean field in Illinois. And it's out in the boonies. You'd never guess that a cemetery was there. But anyway, I found all the people listed who were buried there in a mimeographed folder in the Peoria Library.
Wow.
So, the local library, I think, sometimes is a research place that we don't think of too much. But it was excellent. I was so happy they did that. So
That is,
Yeah,
that
I
is
think,
awesome.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go
I-
ahead,
I-
Dave.
Sorry, I was just going to comment that, yes, the library is a very good place to start from. And I often, when I get a question that doesn't fall under the purview of this library, I'll look up the library for the particular county and send a link to that library's webpage, so that people can check there, and often they're able to direct you to other things in the area. And Pamela, go ahead with your answer. Sorry about talking over you.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, on so many levels, we would be lost without libraries. What kind of a world would it be without libraries? It just can't even imagine. But a lot of libraries have a special research room or section for their county. And you particularly find it in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, well, all over. But, they might have the Harrison County room or the whatever. And you typically find things like that, little mimeograph sheets that somebody donated back in, the 1950s or whatever. And so it's great that Dave does that on behalf of researchers, because there's all sorts of little treasures there that sometimes people don't even think of. So we owe our libraries a lot.
Yes, we do have the Sacramento room here,
Yeah.
and the city directories that Pamela mentioned as being very useful. We have a lot of city directories and city suburban directories also that cover the surrounding area, going back well into the 19th century.
Great resource.
Any more questions?
I do have one more comment. What Pamela said about the obituaries. I agree with her, you really don't know where you're going to find an obituary. My aunt had lived in Denver, Colorado for decades. And when she passed away, there was just a very tiny blurb, really no information about her, just when the service was going to be in the Denver paper. But back in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, where she had spent her childhood, there was a very lengthy obituary naming all of the family and her nieces and nephews and where they were now living. And so really it's good to do a search on somebody, and luckily we have an unusual last name. So it was Frey, F-R-E-Y-E, German. So she was easy to find.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love those success stories. And that is so true. Sometimes locally, in a small town, a rural area, everybody thinks, oh, we know all about this person. They've lived here forever. We know their family. We know all this. But someone who sends that information to another county, another state, and another part of the country, they don't know it. And so you sometimes, and a larger newspaper sometimes has more space and will publish more information. So you just never know. That's a great success story.
And if your newspaper of record happens to be available online, the way the Sacramento Bee is, much of the Sacramento Bee is available through our library website. It is just fantastic to be able to search on a keyword, search on an unusual name, and have things pop up. Not just be looking for obituaries or death notices, but there can be news articles from around the same time, which might relate to cause of death. Things like probate announcements, all kinds of things. It's if the newspaper is online, it's really useful. If it's on microfilm, then it's definitely a bit more of a slog to do complete searches like that.
Very true. Well said, Dave. Very true.
Do we have any more questions? Well, let's see. A mention of how all the papers are expensive to post obituaries. We paid over $1,000 for my mother-in-law's in Napa. And I would comment that I think that's the reason why for more recent deaths, I'm seeing fewer and fewer obituaries and death notices actually published. They're just, for more recent deaths, are much harder to find than in past years.
Very true. And just, earlier, obituaries used to be free. So, that was something that newspapers wanted to print. Newspapers used to print the local births and obituaries. If you submit the information, they would print it. So that's a fairly recent thing in the newspaper world that they charge for obituaries. But in the time when obituaries were free and when newspapers started charging, they weren't all that expensive. You would typically find them in several papers for one person.
There's a comment here from Anthony Virgil about the SAC Bee being very expensive for posting obituaries these days, and I'm sure that's true. And he also mentions that his small town in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin will often post long obits for free. That's very nice.
Yes.
Mentions photos too. The Bee will post a sentence about death for free, basic facts. Posted one paragraph for $186 last fall in Bee. Yeah, if you want to expand on that, Anthony, feel free. Very interesting. And Richard Mills comments that many mortuaries are now posting obituaries online for free. And that's generally findable through Google. So it's definitely worth, for recent ones, definitely well worth a Google search, and also checking findagrave.com.
Yes. And a lot of funeral homes now have online memorials that are accessed and available for a long time.
It's, yeah, a good replacement for newspaper obituaries. Although with that sort of thing, you never know how long it's going to continue available.
That's true. That's very true.
Well, let's see, do we have any more questions? It's just about time to wrap up, I think. Anyone? This presentation is going to be up indefinitely. Yes, thank you, Pamela.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Very nice of you.
And let's see, I'm going to put up the link to our YouTube channel again. Just there we go. Okay, and that also has the email address to contact us at contact@saclibrary.org. And I'm going to post one more time, post our handout one more time. Want to make sure everyone has a chance to download it if they're able. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are next, let me mention next month's. Next month, we're on March 26th. We're going to have Breathe Life into Your Genealogy with the Power of Story by Bill Cole. And I think Bill Cole will be a very interesting speaker. So please join us next month. Thank you, Pamela. Any last words for us?
Happy researching and get out and discover those cemeteries. And thank you for inviting me.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you, Pamela. Great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We'll see you later. Thank you for joining us. See you next month. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.